Texhnolyze is a lot to take in. It's cryptic, it's relentlessly dark, packed with philosophy and psychology, and it all puts an enormous amount of trust in the viewer to put its methodically placed puzzle pieces together. You shift from a brilliant and flashing opening to a quiet and somber world. Episode 1 is uncomfortable. Not a single thing about it is normal. In fact, it's so abnormal it almost feels alienating to watch. But it goes to show the strength of the artist in Hiroshi Hamazaki, because they're capable of making every scene intriguing with very sparse dialogue. They're capable of pulling so much visceral emotion out of a scene with just simple shots of dilapidated buildings and strange angles, which Hamazaki definitely has an affinity for. Most viewers are probably going to take note of the lack of dialogue. It's such a bold decision to have so little lines in your first episode. I also view this as a warning for normal people to leave, because this show is definitely an acquired taste, and it doesn't budge an inch with its decisions.
Bitches leave.
This is show don't tell taken to the absolute extreme. You are either gonna give this a shot, or you flee in terror with the first couple of minutes. I don't think I would blame anybody if they chose to do so either. If this is your first time hearing about Texhnolyze, I urge you to be patient with it. For as different as Texhnolyze is, I don't ever recall switching it off on my first viewing. I was immediately gripped by its mysterious world, and it really spoke to me. There's no hand-holding here for those with short attention spans. One of the things that I was able to pick up more after all these years of rewatching the show is its usage of very subtle symbolism. For example, the scene with Ichisei and the promoter's lover, we get to see dolls placed around the room. They may look sort of human, but they don a very grim and soulless expression. This is a reflection of Ichisei's own stoicism and dehumanized status. You could say the same thing about the people of Lucas too, but it also could be foreshadowing of the shapes and the lifeless shell that they become. Before Ichisei gets his arm removed at the end, there's a brief snippet of a train going across the bridge with water that is coincidentally red like blood. I think this is a visual metaphor for Ichisei having his arm chopped off. The train is his sword moving across his arm, with the water symbolizing the blood. There's also a gecko prominently featured throughout the episode, tied to Ichisei. If you know anything about geckos, they can regrow their own limbs, unlike poor Ichisei here. However, he does end up regrowing his own limb later on when he gets Texhnolyzed, in a sense. Although it may appear though that there really isn't a lot happening in this episode, there's a clear amount of smartly placed foreshadowing and thought poured into this episode. It's almost kind of mean-spirited in a way when you think about it, but I guess Konaka really likes to torture his characters. The first episode is a masterclass in atmospheric and visual storytelling, delivered in the most crushing and bleak way. It feels kind of weird how relatively calm the first few episodes feel, almost surreal in comparison to how things bad get for our cast. Well, the only way that this could get worse is if Gak somehow showed up. Oh no. It goes without saying that Lucas is not a very nice place, and it's immediately established that it's very hierarchical. Even though their society might be a lot more advanced from a technological point of view, it clings to old traditions. It actually seems almost primal when you factor in the gangs and the violence. It's like a bunch of hunters and gatherers. Ichisei is literally placed at the bottom of that very brutal totem pole. Fittingly, his character is almost the exact opposite of his oppressors. Ichisei is like a wild animal throwing himself into conflict with little thought or care and screaming like a caveman, which is helped by the grisly performance of Satoshi Haga. In contrast, the Organo are high and mighty douchebags that walk around in swanky suits. Ichisei has been at rock bottom for most of his life as some kind of prize fighter living in a factory. He's not a typical protagonist, and there's probably a lot of people who would accuse him of being boring. It's very rare to have an almost mute protagonist, and it's also really hard to make them interesting. You really have to pay attention to their actions of the character and make some inferences on their behavior. What I get from his first few interactions here is that he especially hates being pitied when the stand owner gives him some food and he just walks away in disgust. This also shows up again after he's been Texhnolyzed, and he almost has complete disdain for his synthetic limbs. He's probably hyper independent after all those years by himself. He's also more human in a way that a lot of people in the world of Texhnolyze aren't. We'll see how truly apathetic and soulless Lucas is, but in comparison, Ichisei is bursting with life and a desire to live. He's a prime example of what Yoshi wants to see. I also get a sense that he disdains himself after losing his limbs. The final scene features a past version of himself walking up the steps with ease. This is one of the best scenes in the entire show, and it's incredibly powerful in a way I can't even describe. Hiroshi Hamazaki utilizes one of his best techniques here, and in a lot of episodes for that matter, where he makes the background blank with a static filter placed on top of it to put more emphasis on the characters. The combination of the directing and the music provided by Keiichi Arata and Hajime Mizoguchi is simply swaying. I don't know why, but a lot of the music in the show didn't make it to either of the soundtracks that came out, and it left me incredibly disappointed. There is so much good music that I have to go back to the show just to hear brief snippets of. I have compiled some of the lost tracks on my Lost Anime OST playlist on my channel, so if you want to maybe help clean up some of the audio and upload it elsewhere, it'd be much appreciated. Did someone say mommy issues? Well, thankfully Ichisei gets a new pseudo-mother with Doc. Her real name is Eriko, but we'll be using Doc for short here. Doc's relationship with Ichisei is sort of like a surrogate mother. There's a lot of symbolism in the lab, with Ichisei in an almost fetus-like state in the womb. Texhnolyze is a lot about the cyclical nature of life, and him finding a mother that will eventually be taken away from him is an example of that cycle repeating. It's also literally stated in later episodes that she's like a mom, albeit dysfunctional like every other relationship in this series. Not even a high-ranking member of society like Onishi can escape the dysfunction of their world. His wife, Mana, appears to have something mentally wrong with her. Why she's like that is a total mystery, but she's another example of the city turning people into soulless husks. I love the design of Doc's lab, as it's so sterile and emanates this cold feeling to the point it almost feels more hostile than Lucas. It's one of the visual ways that it denotes people's status in society. The class are clean and sterile. Organo look like a bunch of politicians. The Gabe are spiritual and reserved. And the Rakan look like some punk rock group that dropped one album and disappeared. It's only been 3 episodes and the world feels more fleshed out and engaging than a lot of anime. Yoshitoshi Abe said that he wasn't really able to do much in terms of character designs, with some obvious exceptions like Hal and Kano. There's definitely a power in the simplicity of these designs though. It gets across the point of the characters even without a ton of over-the-top design choices. It's not like his designs in Lane were that over-the-top either. That doesn't make them bad. I am particularly fond of some of the actual art pieces that he put out for the show. Most of them elicit that coldness of the show through his usage of greens and blues. I think he also outdid himself in designing the technology. I really like the simplicity of the Texhnolyze limbs. They look functional and have a creepy quality to them. The technologization process is discussed in this episode a lot, and honestly, it just sounds like technobabble to me. One detail about this whole scenario is the fact that Ichisei did in fact survive past losing his limbs. In the real world, you can survive that, but I'm so used to watching anime and movies where a character dies after things like that happen to them. The series, despite its out there concepts at times, feels very real to life in general. There's a palpable sense of indifference and powerlessness that feels so akin to the modern world we live in. Its power dynamics are really horrific, but I want you to take a look around in the real world and tell me that there's no truth in the way that it's presented here. Not even the main characters can really do much of anything. Tragic things occur and come to pass like they would for any real person. Despite Texhnolyze's status as a science fiction show, for me, it's one of prominent psychological horror. The opening of this episode alone could pass off as a horror short on YouTube. The ambience of Texhnolyze fills me with a palpable sense of emptiness. Once again, at the start of the episode, you can see the lifeless mannequins in the shop window as Yoshi stares at them. I've always thought Yoshi's design was deliberately made to be as different as possible from the people as Lucas. We know he comes from a different place, but his sense of fashion is quite peculiar even from what we see from people above ground. He sports a fishing hat and a bright orange outfit that almost makes him appear gentle and approachable, which is incredibly deceptive. There's so many aspects of his character that are contradictory like that, even looking at him from a surface level. His fashion sense also could be another way of showing that he doesn't really fit in within the systems and acts as a wild card. His demeanor is also deceptive, as he's generally shown to be kind. While he walks through Lucas, Ron keeps a very close eye on him because she knows his future and is visibly disturbed by it. I'm sure some viewers would ask why she doesn't do anything about it, but I think it's pretty unrealistic to expect her to fight Yoshi. She's also clinging on to hope at the beginning of the series that something will change. This part is punctuated by a bluesy guitar riff, which is atypical for this kind of show. They could have just gone full electronic with the soundtrack, but it's varied and gives Texhnolyze a more unique atmosphere. Going back to this episode, it's creepy how Yoshi is methodically studying Lucas and all the factions so he can start pulling strings. More information on Texhnolization is presented while Doc feels up Ichisei. There's a really clever use of water going down the drain to communicate that they had sex. I guess it's kinda creepy because she's supposed to be like his surrogate mother to him, but I think Sigmund Freud would very much approve of this part. The way that Texhnolized treats its transhumanist views is very different from the norm. Most people probably look at cyberpunk characters and think about how cool it would be to have a robot arm and how badass they look in it. In Texhnolyze, though, there's a genuine sense of loss presented after being transformed. Ichisei is absolutely disgusted with his new limbs, and it's probably realistic to how some people react to having prosthetic limbs. I've read a lot of amputees tend to carry shame or feelings of inferiority after losing their limbs because they're perceived as lesser. I'd imagine he'd already had a negative image of himself before, but this only serves to remind him of how bad things have become for him. In contrast with the Union and the Organo, the Rakan are focused on freedom and stray from the rules of Lucas. Yoshi drops some wisdom to Shinji and says, "True freedom can't lean on anything. It's transient, lonely, and arduous." This is one of the most memorable and powerful lines from Texhnolyze by a long shot. My interpretation of it is not only do the people of Lucas like Shinji are dependent on the city for powering their limbs, but they're dependent on it from a psychological viewpoint as well. They may view themselves as free, but they're tied down by their ideologies and groups, which are very much not free. It also fits into the story with its themes of free will and fatalism. Can a person truly be free? I think Yoshi probably views himself as being free, as he's discarded society and follows his Ubermensch path, but he's still trapped by his own fate. If he didn't live above ground society and experience its hellish apathy, then he probably wouldn't do what he does. The proverbial die has been cast for him, causing disastrous chains of events. Oh, and Ichisei also gets tortured more in this episode. There's probably a good amount of people that would maybe start to refer this as misery porn, but I don't feel like that's really fair. Texhnolyze is certainly not trying to make you feel good, but I never really got the sense that it was trying to relish in anything that happens. There's sometimes it goes a little overboard when things happen, but it applies the macabre content in a way that's restrained and mature. Ichisei actually shows rare glimpses of heroism in a series that lacks moral characters. Like most apocalyptic media, it's intensely dark as a warning of what's to come if we continue down the path we're going, to try and seek a higher sense of purpose beyond the stagnant norms of our world. One of Texhnolyze's most harrowing scenes comes in the form of a simple interaction with a prostitute. We also get to see part of Yoshi's limbs, which have been Texhnolyzed somehow. This is another mystery that intrigues me of how he ended up with Texhnolyzed limbs. I wonder if he lost them or simply decided to replace them before going down to Lucas because he knew he was going to cause trouble. How he even got his hands on it is more of a mystery. I feel like I need a counter for harrowing scenes in Texhnolyze because the death of the trafficker is haunting in the way that it's directed. The expression of ecstasy on his face as Yoshi pulls his gun out on him has always stuck with me every viewing. Man, what a depressing episode. But the interaction with Ron after Ichisei gets out of the sewers is the closest thing that we get to something wholesome in the show. I think everybody would like a pet from Ron. Repetition briefly features the illumination system key to keeping the citizens of Lucas in order to some degree. The man running the whole system really fascinates me the most because he probably has the most interesting outlook on Lucas as a whole. He's only featured in this episode and his death is implied later in the show, but I would have been more interested in seeing more of him. He's an observer of Lucas and has probably been working at what he does for a while. He also hints at an event that happened a couple years ago when the illumination system stopped working. This event is also referenced later when Onishi hides in the bar after the obelisk is bombed. This implies an almost cyclical nature of the city of Lucas, which falls in line with the Nietzschean themes of eternal recurrence. In this episode, it's brought up that Ishii was also like Ichisei before his limbs were cut off. That also supports the idea that the city is full of people trapped in a cycle. The man mentions that the eyes of the people changed. In previous viewings, I took that as a literal thing, but I'm not really sure if that's the case. The people would probably all have a similar eye color if that was the case. I think it means more in a metaphorical way, like their disposition has changed. Maybe this is responsible for the people of Lucas becoming more apathetic as well. Mana and Onishi's relationship is at least apathetic. I think the phone being disconnected in this scene is symbolic of their relationship, considering how detached they seem from each other. It is interesting that Yoshi brings up gods and goddesses when talking to Doc here, because that made me realize there's actually a bit of a Gnostic angle to the story. In Gnosticism, there are concepts of dualism, which is a good spiritual realm, and then there's the corrupt material world. You could say that the world above would be a good and spiritual realm, while the inherently corrupt world would be Lucas. The material world in Gnosticism is also considered to be false and a prison. If we look at Lucas, it is very much a false and artificial society that almost acts like a prison for the people inside of it. They have been cast out into the material for their inherent evil. Later on in the upper world, it is revealed that the humans that were cast out was because there was a monster lurking inside their hearts. Texhnolyze is about exploring the absolute state of misery that is the material world, and the desire to liberate oneself from the nihilistic loop that these characters find themselves in. It adds up considerably because Konaka usually always includes that element in his stories, even in his past works like Lane. One thing worth noting here is that when Ichisei goes to beat up Ishii, he does so with his human arm and not his technolyzed one. I don't think this is just him refusing to use it out of being unfamiliar with his new arm, but a showing of his resentment for the technology. It also adds insult to injury as it shows that he can fight Ishii even without the help of technolization, and then he gets knocked out for the 900th time. Texhnolyze might be a bit slow for a lot of viewers, but I think the pacing of it is excellent because it rewards you with riveting scenarios. It sets itself up in a way where the dominoes are set and they are knocked down before you know it. I always remember Doc being a bit nicer, but that doesn't really happen until later on. She's a complete asshole at the beginning, and it makes me not really feel as sorry for her when she dies alone at the end. Yoshi toiling around with each faction is my personal favorite part of the series. Since each faction has been prominently featured, I think it's time that we go in depth about them. So far, the Organo has been presented as a formal and traditional government that takes care of the city. They are absolutely corrupt, and most of the members are insanely unlikable and sadistic. They even laugh at the thought of one of their own men having his pecker shot off. They're a pretty typical government kind of institution that you'd see in science fiction. The Salvation Union, they're quite interesting, and they're kind of like an inverse of the technological supremacist you'd see in cyberpunk. They also remind me of a religious organization with its usage of iconography and chants. Just like a religious organization, they also have a hypocritical leader. From what's been revealed, Kamado has a technolyzed limb. The Rakan are a lot more loose and not as interested in domination as the other groups. One thing of note is that Shinji seems to model himself after Onishi. The secretary later points out that he admires him in a way. It's subtle, but I think his design has similar elements to Onishi to show that. The slicked back hair and the suit and tie. He's the most formal looking member out of the group. The direction in episode 7 is on point. The way the increasing violence crescendos on Hamazaki's usage of bizarre angles and music is perfect. One of the most memorable shots is when Yoshi shoots the Organo member and his face completely distorts. This is such a genius and creative way of showing the incredible pain that member is going through. The restraint that Texhnolyze manages to uphold up to episode 8 is commendable. Or really seeing any story try to be this level of subdued is not something that you see all the time, that lets the viewers try to pick the pieces together. One such instance in this episode is the plot that is so subtle you might not really pick it up on the first time. I'm talking about that little deal the Rakan member made with the Organo, which backfired on them, and then they have their limbs cut off. They later present it to the Union as a form of forgiveness or some kind of leverage. That scene with its secretary is one of the scariest to me because of the whimpering and the ruthless violence she enacts. The secretary is another character who's kind of in the background, but she's got a lot more going on than what's presented. She's a silent and a very obedient secretary who seems totally detached emotionally. However, she deeply cares for Onishi and obviously wants his approval more than anything else, which is why she tries so hard on jobs like this. I don't think she really adds too much to Texhnolyze, but it's good that even very small characters like her have her own arc. Now, the main event of this episode is of course the clash that takes place between the factions. Finally, after all these episodes, chaos unleashes in the most cathartic way possible. For those of you who haven't dropped the anime at this point, you're in for a treat. And by treat, I mean some of the most grisly depictions of violence in the medium. Hamazaki is giving it all with his static filters, Dutch angles, and blank backgrounds. Now, the biggest question a lot of people are probably asking is why Ichise went ballistic after going through all the stuff that he went through. There's a couple reasons why you could posit why he did this. The simple one would probably be that he obviously hates most of the group involved and saw an opportunity to strike. Another one would be before the violence starts to break out, I think Yoshi kind of gets the ball rolling by irritating Ichise, which he responds to with a punch. Ichise is like humanity's most primal instincts distilled into one person. He solves a lot of his problems by punching them, because that's kind of all he knows. It might be a bit far to call him stupid per se, but he's a very impulsive character that runs on instinct. I think it's part of the self-destructive cycle that he's been introduced to. This one might seem a bit out here, but the pessimistic philosopher by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer came up with this concept of the will, which is a blind and very irrational force that constantly strives. No character in the show embodies the concept of the will better than Ichise, who throws himself at any given chance to exert himself. This show will later dive into that with the irrational mindset that exists in all humans that cause them to suffer. Wiggle is kind of a funny name for such a heavy episode. I'd assume it resembles the chaotic jerkiness of the events taking place. It always scares me how quickly the city and civilization ends up crumbling in Texhnolyze's world. One string of bad events and the entire city is thrown into decay. It also feels realistic in a sense when you look at real-world examples and see how quickly civilizations can disappear in an instant. That's one of the biggest contributors to why Texhnolyze disturbs me much more as a show than anything I've ever watched. It differs from most other apocalyptic settings where it's a nuke or a zombie. Rather, it presents a very harsh and agonizing systematic failure on all fronts that makes the two examples I just listed sound like heaven in comparison. The Organo are also frighteningly accurate to reality in the way that they rule the city and the way that their personalities are presented. Mizuno is the organization distilled down to its worst traits. He definitely doesn't remind me of any current political figures at all. One thing I've always found out about him being tied to the bombings is just how obvious it is by looking at him. His character design alone looks like one of those mustache trolling villains from a Persona game. He's just a lot more bold and upfront with his intentions than some of the other members. Characters like Kohakura, although they may be more gentle and likable than most of the members, eventually reveal their true face at some point. Most of the members don't really have much in terms of depth, but I think they're just more so to represent the broken and unchanging systems set in place in Lucas. I can't say her death was very impactful to me, because we spend no time with her, but it does give us a very good moment with Onishi, tossing his phone angrily to the ground. This is pretty much one of the only moments in the show where Onishi's stoic facade breaks. I can't imagine that Onishi is a happy person, or really anybody in the show is, but he's one of the strongest characters in the show due to how composed he remains. This moment says a lot considering a lot of the traumatic and awful things he's experienced in life. You can see why Ichise ends up looking up at him as a surrogate father later on. They might not share the same quality of life, but they can both relate to each other in terms of the pain that they experience, especially with the loss of a loved one that you couldn't be there to help. The first arc of Texhnolyze finally comes to its bitter conclusion with the people on the hill's arrival. I've always been curious why they chose to fluctuate between the people on the hill and the class. Both of them sound ominous and to the point with their simplicity. I suppose it makes sense for Yoshi to refer to them as that because he's a stranger to Lucas. Even Onishi and other people call them that as well. Their name is also interesting because it reinforces their hierarchical mentality. The way that they are shown is dressing similar to Doc with the all-white clothing and almost quasi-religious appearance. They look totally pure and alien in comparison to the people of Lucas. Also, to push the religious aspect of them, the meeting between the class and Goto looks like it takes place in a church setting. Despite how Texhnolyze appears to be a world lacking spirituality, there are certain religious elements to the show. We've already made a Gnosticism connection, but the way that Onishi talks to the city for guidance is almost like a religious person asking God for help. It's strange because Onishi seems rational to the point of almost being robotic. Later in the series, when Ichise goes berserk after Onishi's death, there's a completely out-of-nowhere moment where he regains his power to his limb that also rubs me as a little spiritual. But we'll get to that baffling moment later on. The thing that held my attention the most was the fact that Yoshi seems to select Shinji of all people to awaken Lucas. I'd assume it's because Shinji is a rebellious, free-spirited person who will challenge the city, while he skips Organo and almost entirely ignores the Union because they both stand for a more stagnant and authority-based society that causes Lucas to be in the shape that it's in. If you look at the world above ground, there's almost an authoritarian aspect of it that could probably spawn the apathy that Yoshi hates so much. His desire to awaken the people of Lucas is also comparable to the concept of gnosis in Gnosticism, which means to rid oneself of ignorance. If one obtains this, they can escape their flawed and illusory material world. Yoshi does, albeit in a very morbid way, try to free them of their ignorant bubble. I'm really glad that Texhnolyze had the smarts to kill off his character instead of dragging him out. His presence in Texhnolyze is very brief, but he's one of the best characters in the medium, hands down. I don't think I even understood him the first time I watched Texhnolyze, but there's so much depth to his character that he feels like a breath of fresh air in terms of anime villains. I don't know why, but I find the beginning of the second half of the anime to be kind of relaxing. There's a middle ground here where there's no overarching villain like Yoshi, and it's not as grim as is about to get. There's even a sparse moment of comedy where Mizuno humiliates himself in front of every organization. Texhnolyze generally lacks a lot of levity, but this moment is so funny. Mizuno is truly one of the greatest characters in fiction. The actual star of this episode is Toyama. I know none of the characters in the show have decent lives, but Toyama's by far is the worst sounding to me. Being used by your father your whole life and trying to cut off all ties by him by damaging yourself is horrific. The worst part is that Kohakura is also shown to take advantage of him. I'd assume Toyama probably used his services, so to speak, to climb up the ranks as well. Toyama's bond with Ichise is overlooked in terms of close relationships too. Usually Doc or Onishi are brought up, but Toyama is like a brother to him in many ways, teaching him the ropes and even stepping in to protect him a couple times, which is probably the first in Ichise's lifetime. I absolutely love the scene where Toyama steps in to intervene against a group of thugs. It's such a raw and powerful lesson about human nature and crab bucket mentality. The scenery in this episode is also some of my favorite in the whole show. I love that its aesthetic is largely focused on dilapidated and rusty buildings. It almost gives me Silent Hill vibes. For me, the scene that really takes the cake is the final one with Mizuno panting while the bomber points to him. The way that it's directed is absolutely genius and disturbing. Mizuno's breath grows louder with each shot of his quivering lips. Then it cuts to a white screen. We don't even get to see how Organo dealt with him, so you can only imagine how horrific his death was. It's so smart to completely leave out his fate like that. It kind of reminds me of what Stanley Kubrick said about leaving the audience to put the pieces together themselves instead of being direct with certain things. I have to say that putting the pieces together in Texhnolyze has been such a gratifying experience for me. I do feel like sometimes watching Texhnolyze is like looking at a lost form of art because it's so hard to find storytelling like this. Texhnolyze has one of the most depressing interpretations of fatalism I've ever seen, and that all rests on the poor shoulders of Ron. In a sense, Texhnolyze is like a modern Greek tragedy. That sounds weird on paper, but if you look at someone like Ron, she's kind of like a Greek oracle. Cassandra of Troy is a similar kind of character that's perceived as insane and such after being foretold a prophecy that ends up becoming true. In Ron's case, she kind of goes insane in this episode, but for the most part she ends up being an apathetic shell. The weight that she must carry is beyond words, because it's enough to make her so uncaring to the point she's practically mute. At the beginning of the show, she was kind of more drawn to Ichisei, and I wonder if she thought that Ichisei might be able to change the tide after killing Yoshi. It's at that point she realizes that nothing can be changed and gives up. Inevitable fates are usually a staple of Greek tragedies, and let's not forget that there's also an episode entitled Hades. Ikusei is a character I wish we got more time with, like many other characters in the series, but you have to take into account that there are a lot of things going on here and a lot being juggled. There's so much in terms of creativity, and doing so in an intelligent manner is very difficult. You have to pick and choose what's going to be expanded upon and what won't be. But it is very satisfying to see Ichisei punch his father's framer at the end of this episode. This is one of the most iconic punches I've ever seen in an anime. You can really feel the impact and all the hate behind that fist. This is precisely why Hiroshi Hamazaki excels at delivering intense action. Before we move on to next episode, it's also worth noting that Kohakura hints at his inevitable sighting with Kano in the sauna scene. He says he doesn't intend to grow old in the way that the class has. Agape Village is one of my favorite factions in the show, not only due to their calming spiritual aesthetics, but because of their outlook on everything. They remind me most aspects of Buddhism with their view of going with the flow. They're often signified by their fox or kitsune masks. In Shintoism, there's a deity called Inari, which is a fox linked to agriculture and fertility. To contact people, Inari usually sends messengers through foxes, often to ward off evil. They're usually white, but only Ron is predominantly associated with the white mask. She is the voice of the city that's been communicating with Onishi, and I wondered why exactly she chose to only speak to him, but I guess for as flawed as he is, he represents some level of order in the city. She also communicates with our mysterious new villain, Kano.
Hello, Lex.
We'll get to that blue-haired freak later, but now let's focus on Ichisei in this episode. Everything seems like it was going better for Ichisei up until he ended up clobbering his father's backstabber in the last episode. In this episode though, he's almost back to his original state of being. Right when he finally got his reason to live, which is to get revenge, it was stripped away from him. He's a character who's simply been led along the whole time and hasn't really thought too much about his own purpose. Toyama asked him that question in the previous episode, and the Organo trader in this episode urges him to stray away from his path, but he's totally lost. That much is evident in his conversation with Onishi in the back of the truck. This conversation is probably the warmest interaction that Ichisei has in the whole series. You can definitely feel a fatherly bond starting to grow here. Although the class might seem and sound more sophisticated on the surface, they're just as cruel as the gangs in the city. Kano is revealed to be a sort of psychopathic man-child later in the series, but Doc is not too far off from him in certain traits. For one, she doesn't really respect the autonomy of other people, and treats Ichisei like an object, and by extension the people of Lucas as well. You could argue that she does take care of Ichisei in the city to some extent, but still not a great person either way. It makes sense why she ends up being so screwed up when you look at where she came from, possibly instigating another cycle of abuse, especially on her own patients. She seems like one of the loneliest characters within Texhnolyze. She sits inside her bone-white lab all day on the hill, and doesn't really fit in with the class or any of the gangs. Maybe that's a good reason she got attached to Ichisei and isn't capable of forming healthy relationships. One good trait about her is that she states that she thinks technolization should not be used for violence. Unfortunately, the worst aspects of human nature have seeped through the cracks, and she's probably one of the only few people in Lucas that think that way. I have to wonder how many people she's technolyzed over the years, because she seems like the only character in the series capable of doing that procedure, although someone had to operate on the likes of Yoshi for him to obtain the body he has, unless he did it himself, which seems kind of silly and outlandish. I'd imagine there are probably more people in the series capable of doing similar operations. Episode 14 fills me with existential dread because of the strings being pulled behind the scenes. In the last episode, we got a glimpse of all the weapons in Gabe Village, and more equipment is being shipped out in this episode. The first time I watched Texhnolyze, I didn't really connect the dots here, but once you understand what they're being used for in the upcoming conflict, it creates such an eerie detail. Amazing how something so simple can inspire so much fear. Welcome to the most depressing stretch of episodes in any anime ever. This is another reason why there aren't a ton of people analyzing Texhnolyze, because not only is it suffocatingly bleak, but it requires going through again and again to get a better understanding of it. Anyways, the opening of this episode was always stuck with me, the way the camera stays fixed on the killer's horrified eyes as it pans back to the unsuspecting crowd. Episode 15 feels so much more different than the rest of the series because it has a horror vibe to it. There's mention of stark white ghosts that sort of take people away. Now, I said that Texhnolyze is like a psychological horror series, but there's traces of cosmic horror in there as well. Konaka is a massive Lovecraft fan, and there are components of the class that feel ripped straight from Lovecraft himself. One of the key traits of cosmic horror is the indifferent reality, which is obvious, but I would like to look at the class specifically. They remind me most of the Marsh family from Shadow over Innsmouth. The breeding part of the Marsh family reminds me the most of the class, and it's mentioned that Kano was an inbred child. The people of Innsmouth also make a pact with Dagon and become hybrid humans, like how the people of Lucas become the Shapes later on. The unveiling of a false reality with the surface world is also Lovecraftian. That's why 15 is one of my favorite episodes to go back to because of how spooky it is. It's also important because everything starts to fall into place and we finally get a look at our new villain, Kano. In previous viewings, I didn't really care for Kano as much, but he's grown on me in repeated viewings. I do feel like Kano is a little step down from Yoshi, but it's pretty hard to live up to him. It's mostly due to the fact that he's actually largely absent from the end of the series. He's only got a couple scenes dedicated to him, but what we gather is that he's an insane man-child who wants to purify Lucas, who's also solipsistic. He takes transhumanism to the extreme and makes Lucas into his own image, which shows the soullessness of a society that values technological advancement over humanity. To me, he feels a little uncooked, but there's a lot going on at the end of the series, and they were clearly more interested in the above ground. A lot of people probably wonder why so many people in the gangs chose to join Kano so easily. There really doesn't seem like much gain from transforming into the Shapes, but you have to take in consideration that the people within the gangs are power-hungry, nihilistic assholes. For people like Hal and most of the Organo members, their motivations would line up. I wonder if the series didn't end the way it does, if the Shapes might have betrayed Kano. The Union members' reasoning makes my head scratch a little because I understand their frustrations with the Kamada, but jumping to Kano's side doesn't really make much sense. Just abandoning their morals out of nowhere like that feels a little forced, but I guess it shows how fragile loyalty can be between people. The real calm before the storm is when Ichise starts to talk with Father Goto. We haven't seen much of him, but he seems like such a nice man and far more pleasant than any of the members in Organo. It's another touching scene where Goto tries to Ichise find the meaning in his life. Texhnolyze might have an overbearing, nihilistic tone to it, but a lot of the characters in the show hold sort of anti-nihilistic statements. They constantly pose to Ichise on what he wants to do, and people like Yoshi are trying to give people a meaning through their violent actions. That's followed up by the reveal of the Shapes. Yoshitoshi Abe said that he didn't work on mechanical stuff like this before Texhnolyze, so this was very challenging for him. I think it's one of the coolest and creepiest cyborg android designs, or whatever you call the Shapes. The lanky torsos combined with the angular pieces of metal jutting out is so intimidating, especially that helmet with a singular piercing blood red eye. Nightmarish stuff. The Shapes feel really jarring, and not in a bad way, but like in a nightmarishly surreal way. They signify Texhnolyze's transition into something more bizarre. I think we can all agree that the real star of the show here was Kamada with his very memorable death. This is probably what he's most remembered for because he honestly doesn't do much in the show. He just sits around and acts all pompous, but his speech in this episode was killer. You might notice there's a lot of gross looking infected spots on his body, which is gangrene. From my understanding, the process of technolization doesn't necessarily cause the gangrene in itself, but it does have a high rejection rate. Otherwise, a lot of the other characters would have had gangrene by now. Kamada is one of the only heroic characters in Texhnolyze. I don't think he really does anything wrong in the series and is dead on when it comes to technolization. While we're on the topic of death and despair, it was really good that they gave Hal that little plot line where he leaves a Rakan out of jealousy, or else his death would fall pretty flat. Doc reveals in this episode that Ichise's limb does not actually have his mother's cells in it. She lied to him so that he would remain psychologically dependent on her and so that she could continue to experiment on him. Out of all the characters in the show that are inhumane to Ichise, Doc is by far one of the most abusive and manipulative to him. Another thing you'll notice in the final episode is Kanos' use of the word sister. This is in reference to Ron, but this may not be a biological connection. Some people theorize that she is linked to him due to the color of their eyes being the same, which would raise a lot of questions if she's connected with the class then. In episode 18, it was revealed that the mothers from the class were able to speak to Onishi, and that might explain why Ron is also able to telepathically communicate with other people. If that's not the case, it's just Kano's weirdness and his desire to control her to take over Lucas. It makes sense why he'd go after her above everyone else because she's in contact with the entirety of Lucas. Kano has one of the most convincing portrayals of insanity that I've ever seen on screen. He's not flailing around like a madman, but he's more quiet and subdued. He talks in a soft, monotonous voice, and his ramblings sound so disjointed sometimes. The creepiest thing is when he refers to weapons as getting back his toy from his mother's at the class. He exhibits some childish mannerisms here when he sits on the floor cross-legged in front of them. There's a part of me that almost feels a little bad for Kano. Like most characters in the world, really stand much of a chance, and growing up in the environment of the class could not have been a healthy one. This episode is a collage full of depressing moments. One of the bleakest images in the show has to offer is Shinji sitting in his car with the corpse of Hal. Usually in most anime, if they became this stomach-churningly morbid, I would have probably given up on them by now. But Texhnolyze is one of the few animes that makes me want to push to the end. It's scary to think how fast the shapes make clean work of the people of Lucas. I find the way that they kill them incredibly gruesome. The holes they form with their guns are different from most media I've seen, where there'll be uneven pieces of flesh sticking from the insides. Here, it looks like they straight up got a clean hole punched right through them. Lucas could feel very isolating and hostile, but the final episode fills me with an indescribable melancholic feeling that I've never experienced in any piece of art ever. It literally makes my heart heavy to think about it. I feel so bad for the secretary in this episode because she straight up gets ditched by Onishi, and it's the last time that she'll be seeing him. Texhnolyze doesn't treat any of its characters well, but sometimes it feels like Konaka had it set up for the secretary. Onishi does love her to some extent, but not nearly as much as he thinks. He does act coldly to her, but he does give her a long look before going with Kamada, and also relieves her pain at the end of the series. When one lives in such a bedlam like Lucas, they would hope for some type of escape, and that comes in the form of the upper world. The title of this episode may be Heaven's Word, but once arriving to the surface world, it becomes clear that it's anything but. On the surface level, it might look pleasing, but it's about as isolating and apathetic as the city of Lucas. When Yoshi arrives at Lucas, there was a scene of him taking in the scenery and the hopeless state of the people there. The upper world mirrors this, with many of its residents simply standing in fixed positions with their faces rarely being shown. It's like a painting by Edward Hopper coming to life. Everything about the surface world is just agonizing on an aesthetic front. The lifeless people in the cities that clash with the beautiful blue skies, with the sound of lonely locust in the background. It's a society that basks in its own apathy. It's easy to see why Yoshi ends up going insane living in this kind of environment day after day. The way that work life is presented with Sakimura seems so hollow. His boss doesn't even care that Yoshi is dead. I view this as a critique of Japanese societies, or maybe society as a whole, especially in this scene. The way that Sakimura, or really everybody on the surface, seems to be treated as a meaningless number. Sakimura and Yoshi saw going to Lucas as a means to actually live their lives with purpose, and not just living for the sake of living. Another way I think the surface world critiques society is with its characters, Saginuma. For some reason, he seems to have several avatars, like the girl, and then there's the glowing chair on top of the blocks. God, I forgot how weird these episodes are. Saginuma is only following formalities just because. And that would cause a meaningless and stagnant world. That would make the surface world just about as empty as Lucas is. They've also abandoned their humanity just like them as well. At the end of the episode, Ichise and Doc end up watching a film that covers the backstory of their world. From what I can gather here, there was some sort of violent conflict that influenced their decision to put people down into Lucas. It probably frustrates some of the viewers that it's not completely explained through dialogue, but this way it keeps the world of Texhnolyze more mysterious and allows the viewer to put the pieces together by themselves. Texhnolyze is a show that requires you to view it multiple times, and even then, you might just be scratching at the surface. This episode is called Hades, which is a callback to the series' heavy Greek tragedy inspiration, but it's also in reference to the state of the surface world. The citizens here aren't really what you would call alive in a sense, but there appears to be an indication of dead souls residing in the surface world. Whether this is literal or just surreal moments is left ambiguous, but we see the likes of Yoshi and Akuze, which are long gone. To add to the body pile, we have Doc. She's acted a bit better towards him in the past 2 episodes. They even frequently held hands like a mother and a child would. Her relationship between Ichise has been like a mother, lover, and cold professional wrapped up in one. She's shown she's capable of treating him right, but I don't really blame Ichise for leaving her there. It seems he might not have really cared for her at all, and she is kind of part of a reason why he starts to go down a dark path in the first place. She says that she was attracted to Ichise because he had the same kind of eyes as the first generation, which is why they were sent down to Lucas. I don't know if that's a figurative sense or not, but it implies that Ichise acts drastically different from generations of people. I'd assume it has to do with his propensity towards violence and acting on an instinctual basis. It's also shown in the footage from the last episode that there was some kind of violence that the generation perpetrated which outcasted them from the surface world. I think that's the monster that the narrator refers to in the next episode. There's something inherently bad about those people in that generation. In Gnosticism, it's believed that the human condition is inherently flawed, but the blame for that is put on the doorstep of the flawed creator. The body is viewed as chaotic and evil and traps people within the corrupt material world. Doc often expresses the desire to evolve past their bodies into a new species, and even the Theonormal want to escape their own stagnant evolution. I thought they might have been on a tighter budget towards the end of the series because there's a lot of lengthy bits of narration in this episode and the next one. Some of it's probably an artistic decision, but there's so many scenes like that. This episode is called encephalopathy, which is a general term for brain damage. This is alluding to the fate of all the shapes, but it's also symbolic in the way that the people of Lucas are acting. Ron hasn't been acting right since Yoshi's demise, but here she's straight up acting insane. She initially is the purest character in the show, but she grows completely apathetic and heartbroken by yet another cycle of violence that the people have chosen. She's essentially accepted the fate of the people, and has chosen to try to end the city to stop the cycle. Kano moves from calling her sister to Theoria. This stems from Greek philosophy, which means contemplation or to see, which fits in with her seer or oracle role. Episode 21 remains one of the hardest to sit through in the series for me. The deaths in this episode are so bleak that I don't even understand how Konaka conceived of it. The secretary's death in this scene is downright one that I hate, and it feels beyond mean-spirited to me. I think it goes way too far. In comparison, the Gabe Elder gets off incredibly easy with his passing, but he drops an absolute bombshell saying that the people turn into Raphia. This suggests another cycle for potential rebirth for the city of Lucas, even after its grim fate. It's a pretty bleak spin on reincarnation because that makes the whole cycle feel meaningless. The death of me the hardest in this series is Shinji by far. His psychological state is utterly devastated in a harrowing way. The way he rattles off about old times while arming himself sends a chill down my spine. There's this piano in the background while he's doing it as well. It's so harrowing. And so is Onishi's for that matter. My leg! It's incredibly ironic that the only thing remaining of him are his Texhnolyze limbs. Like Ron said to him, he will be destroyed by what he's lost. A lot of things about Kano feel deliberately theatrical. At the beginning of this episode, it plays out like a silent movie with Kano watching over the city's destruction. The narrator calls Kano a king. It's almost like the script was written by Kano himself, and every scene is how he would view it. I think it's a way of showing Kano's delusions of godhood. He also fittingly has pitched his headquarters in an opera house. It's like he's watching the demise of the city like a movie. He views them through a solipsistic lens where they only exist within his mind. Okay, let's talk about that moment. How does Ichisei manage to get his limbs working again? Through willpower, obviously, but surely there's gotta be more than that. I think it also starts working again because he's finally embraced his limbs as his own. At the beginning of the series, he absolutely despised his limbs and couldn't pair with them well. The only time that they began to really work with them is when he finally accepts them. He embraces them with a shot of Doc in her office. She essentially is living through his arm as she puts her own materials, so to speak, inside his limbs. After Ichisei ransacks everything, he's once more met by Kohakura in a group of shapes. This scene shows how pointless and hollow the life of a person who abandons their organic nature. It's also one of the most harrowing images in Texhnolyze. There's a lot of dragonflies present in this scene in particular. Shapes have now become cocooned just like an insect. To end this draining cycle once and for all, Ichisei finishes off Kano and Ran, and that's it. Or is it? It's more likely that there will be another cycle of sorts that will continue on. The last scene features Ichisei staring at a projected image of a raffia flower before he dies, which could imply another generation to come. Kano also suggested that he will live on through consciousness, but it's likely another delusion by him. Texhnolyze is a show that isn't going to appeal to a lot of people, but it's certainly for me. Texhnolyze demands so much from its viewer and subjects them to relentless tragedies. There's also nothing, and I mean nothing else like it. I'm surprised that something so artistic and uncommercial was put out. It doesn't budge on any of its artistic proclivities and doesn't seem to care if you don't like it. It is pure in essence, and I just wanted to everyone involved in making sure this anime got made. I have never had any kind of art touch me in the way that Texhnolyze has, and thank you to the few viewers that have stuck around at this point. This is the last time I will be doing a retrospective on this anime. If I have any updated thoughts on the series, I will make another video on it, and make sure to check out other people's analysis as well. There's plenty of good analysis videos on Texhnolyze out there, and thank you once again. Before I go here, I did want to say that the preservation of Texhnolyze has been very, very poor. There's really not many ways to consume the show, and I barely got some of the DVDs for it. They're kind of cool with the menus, and they even have these neat little bumpers before an episode. I'm bringing some awareness to this in hopes that someone will get Texhnolyze in better hands, or at least put out a Blu-ray or something.